Hello, and welcome back to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and today we are once again perfecting page layout. Today we're going to be looking at two functions in Finale that allow you to space the systems evenly in your documents, which are kind of handy. One of them exists in the page layout tool and is called Space Systems Evenly. We'll talk about that first, and then next we'll talk about the plugin version of this, which has a very similar name called Space Systems. It's in the scoring and arranging section. Now this is a built-in plugin Finale, so all of you will have that plugin. But let's talk about the native version Space Systems Evenly function in the page layout menu. We get a little window that's sort of simple, easy to understand. Space Systems Evenly on. Again, we have the option to choose the scope of this for the parts or score, selected parts or score. And if I had actually linked parts, you'd see a list of linked parts. You can choose just the score or whatever linked part you need. All parts or all parts and score. So we have that option there. And then we have page options, so we can choose to change just page 1, all pages, or a page range, page 1 through 5, for example, 2 through 7. And again, with these windows, if you leave this last one blank, it means through the end of the page. So this would be 3 through the end. So a lot going on here with just the scope of it, but for now we're just going to deal with a single page, page 2 actually, which is this page. And you can see that my systems are not they're not evenly spaced on this page. So this little function here is going to help with that. Now, literally all this thing is doing is spacing the systems evenly on the page. There are some options here for percentage full, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and then 3 options for how to distribute the systems. This one, the third one here, it will be set by default. Do not change the number of systems on each page, but we can let Finale try and place the maximum number of systems on each page, which occasionally can be handy. Or we can try and set it so that it's placing 3 systems on each page. This is kind of handy if you want to do this on a range of pages. But in this case, let's just stay with do not change number of systems for page 2 and see what the Space Systems Evenly does. So we click OK. And just like that, it does what it says. It spaced the systems evenly on the page. Now, the thing you have to understand about this is when it does that, it throws the top system in line with the top page margin. So that top system margin is in line, and the bottom system's bottom margin is in line with the bottom page margin. Now, this occasionally, or most of the time actually, really is not a great thing to do because, again, as we know, the data within the systems often goes outside of the page margin. And depending on how you have your text set up here, you're going to get a lot of overlap, like you can see right here. This can be avoided if you have some much larger top and bottom system margins, but I don't particularly care for this, but I can just show you it. So I've just set systems 4 through 7 to have 0.35 instead of 0.25, and we'll just make these fit on one page here. And then when we use that Space Systems Evenly for page 2 now, we'll get a slightly better result because the system margins are a little bit higher. Again, it's making the gap between the system margin and the page margin 0. It's so whatever you have here for the system margins themselves, that will also affect that. This kind of comes in play particularly on the page 1 where you have the text here. So, I mean, I have seen people use Finale where they will bring this page margin all the way down here. So that when you do this putting this top system margin against the page margin will still be below the text, but a lot of us will still leave this top margin above the text like this. So using this function on page 1 is always going to be a problem because you're going to get a result like this. Finale is just going to ignore that big gap. Of course, you can get around this just by moving that top margin of the first system so that now it's already against the top margin here. You can actually do a little bit the same with the bottom one if you wanted to, just make that a lot wider there. And now when you do this for page 1, you'll get a much better result. But again, you're sort of chasing around margins and everything. It just doesn't seem to be the most efficient way to do it, particularly when you can just, grab your systems and move them a little bit. I mean, this takes almost less time to do than actually going through that whole process. So again, there is some usage for the Space System Evenly, but a lot of times it's just as easy to kind of move some of this stuff manually. I don't need to really go through this. Place maximum number of systems on each page. If I set this and do like all pages, what you'll see is Finale is going to try and put 4 systems on page 1 here. So again, it thinks that 4 systems can fit, which technically it can, but again, it gets in the way of the title there. And you can also choose, 3 systems on a page. So if I wanted to go 2 through the end, 3 systems on a page, all of a sudden now we'll get 3 systems on a page, again with the weird gapping because it's throwing the top and bottom systems up against the page margins. And then finally, the other option here has to do with space pages more than 60% full. This is really relevant when you have a last page like this, where it's likely that you don't want these to be spread out. So this allows you to sort of set a value here where it won't spread them out. Now in this case, 60% full. This is actually more than 60% full, so it will respace this page 11 here if I use this. So check it out, it does that. However, if I had chosen a larger value there, 75, this hasn't met the threshold of 75%, which is probably somewhere here. So it will leave that last page alone. Although I did that on page 10 by mistake, but just to prove it, there we go, on page 11, and it will leave that last page alone. All right, so that's what's going on with the space systems evenly function. Fairly simple, but also somewhat limited in usage, in my opinion. What I want to talk about is the other plugin in the scoring and arranging section called Space Systems. Very similar name, kind of similar function, but this one's a little bit more intuitive or comprehensive, I should say. So I do find this one a little bit more useful. So just talking about some of these sections here, let's talk about the pages. We can choose the current page, and this current page will always be whatever's here. So if I actually move over to page 2, you'll see it change to page 2, page 3, etc. You can change all pages. This is very similar to the other box, a single page or selected pages, and you can choose, a range 2 through 7 or something. Now, with this window, for some reason, this works a little bit differently. You can't leave this blank to get to the end. For this window, you do actually have to indicate what the last page is, so page 11 in this case, in order to get 2 through the end. All right, so a couple different things with the range. For certain ones of these options, we do have the current part or score, all parts, score, and all parts options. We do not have the selected score or parts option in this particular plugin, which is interesting, but we do have another option called scores in all open docs, which is interesting. So if you have 5 or 6 documents open at once, you can actually apply this plugin and it will work on all 5 of those documents, which is kind of interesting. But for now, we'll just leave it on current part or score, but just know you have lots of options there. Now, there's sort of 2 sections for this. There's dealing with single systems, and you have 4 different options here. And there's dealing with multiple systems, which is here, and you have a few more options on the multiple systems. Now, this has to do with how many systems are on the page in your score. So in this particular score, this piano violin, every page has multiple systems, so it's going to reference this particular aspect of it, and it's going to ignore the single systems. In a full score, I have to go and reopen that plugin when you do this. In a full score, because each page is a single system, it's basically going to ignore the multiple systems section and only reference the single system section. There may be occasions where you have a score that has some single system pages and some multiple system pages. It's probably a little bit rare that that would be the case. But if that's the case, then it will actually process both of these sections at the same time on your score if the page range encompasses both types of those pages. So for that reason, I think they included the option of none so that you could ignore the single system pages if you have a range of different single and multiple system pages. Same thing with the multiple systems. You can choose none to ignore the multiple systems in that instance. All right, so that's just a way to kind of filter those out. But for the single system, since I'm in the score here, let's just talk about what's here. We have 3 other options, top, center, and bottom. And effectively what this does is it will space the system to the top, the center, or the bottom of the page. So actually what I'm going to do is go to page 2 here, zoom out just a little bit so you can kind of see what this the system margins here. Here's the top margin, here's the bottom margin, and we'll see what this does. So we're current page 2, let's go to top and click apply. And you can see that it throws the system all the way to the top so that the top system margin is in line with the top page margin. If I were to choose center, it would center the margins, the top margin and the bottom margin. You'd have equal gap between the bottom margin and the bottom page margin and the top margin and the top page margin, right? So that's what center does. And of course, again, it ignores anything that's beyond the boundaries of the system margin. And in this case, I do have these measure numbers, which are much lower than the boundary of the system margin, which is why this doesn't quite look centered on the page, right? Because these bar numbers are very close to the edge of the page relative to the white space that I have here at the top. So again, it's really referencing the margins, not the data that's in or outside of the margins. And of course we have the bottom, which is actually going to make this situation even worse because it's going to pin the bottom margin to the bottom page margin. So now those bar numbers are really low and almost off the page. So you do sort of have to be aware of where your system margins are when you're dealing with things like this. Now we also have, I haven't talked about this yet, this little section here for extra margins, which is really handy. These will apply extra margins on top of any setting that you have here. So, for example, if I choose the top, which would normally put the top system margin up against the top page margin, but I choose an extra margin of, let's say, 0.25 inches here, what will happen is it will put that top margin close to the top page margin, but exactly 0.25 inches below the top of the page margin. So this is actually a great extra tool to have a little bit more control. It works the same with the bottom margin. In fact, if I choose bottom and choose, let's say, 0.4 here and hit apply, you'll see that it's still too low, but the bottom margin is now 0.4 from the bottom page margin. I hope you guys can see this on the screen here. So there's a bunch of options there. And even actually it will work with the center one for this single system. So if I do center plus 0.2, it's going to center the system and then add 0.2 at the top. So the gaps will not be completely equal in this case. It will be 0.2 larger on the top than on the bottom. So a bunch of different options available to you with the extra margin, and depending on how you have the single systems set up, you can get a lot of different results this way. So that's the single system section here. So actually let's go over to my other file, which has multiple systems, and start looking at the multiple system processes here. And there's a few more options here. We have space evenly, which does something very similar to the other function in the page layout tool, the space systems evenly function. Actually kind of does the same thing. If these margins are set to 0, we can do this. And actually, let's just, for safety, put this at none here. Go to space evenly. Let's go to page 2 here. And we'll see it do the same thing that the other one did, where it's going to put the top and bottom margins in line with the top and bottom page margins, right? So you can see exactly what's going on there. Now, the difference between this plugin and the other one is the availability of this extra margin, which is super, super helpful. So now I can actually put a top and bottom margin here of 0.2 and 0.2, and using the space evenly function, and what you'll see is that it will space them evenly plus 0.2 in the top and bottom margins, which is, a much better result. This actually looks really quite good, just setting this up just like that. Let's get this back to where I have sort of an uneven setting here. Of course, you can just choose the top to do this, and of course it will throw the bottom one in line. So lots of different permutations of using the extra margins here with the space evenly. We also have a little bit more further control here in the multiple systems with the keep topmost system fixed option here, and this will do just that. Wherever this top system is, it will stay in place and then fill out the systems below that. when you use the space evenly, you can see that will happen just like that. This top one stays exactly where it was. The rest have been pushed down towards the bottom page margin. Of course, this can also be, combined with another bottom extra margin here to get different. Again, there's just so many different variations of using this window. So it's, super handy. Just depends on how you want to do that. So that's keep topmost system fixed. And this option will work with pretty much all of these other options. So again, there's just a lot of combinations here. Let's look at the next one down here. Let's undo that. Space evenly, space with additional gaps. Okay, so what this will do is essentially it will look at the value of the gaps here, and you can kind of see that I have different values between each system here. So this one is 0.4, this one is 0.23, this one is 0.29. So there's different values. When you use the space with additional gaps, it's going to continue to, it's basically going to add gap equally to each space. So if I were to do the same thing, and actually let me just do this, I'll keep topmost system fixed again, space with additional gaps. Again, it will throw that bottom system to the bottom page margin. And so it looks like it's doing something similar to space evenly, but it's not actually even because this gap is still larger than this one, and this one's larger than this one. So now it says, what is that, 0.57, that is 0.4, that is 0.46. So it's sort of spreading them out proportionally in that sense. It's actually adding the same amount of gap to each distance here to get the bottom one to the bottom margin. And of course, we can combine this with a bottom extra margin as well. Again, all kinds of different options here to use this plugin. The next one here is space proportionally. This one's very similar to the space with additional gaps, but it actually is a little bit more, it uses different math is basically what I'm trying to say. And if you have something extreme like this, where you have a really small gap between systems 4 and 5 and a really large gap between systems 5 and 6, the space proportionally is going to add proportional amount of space to that gap. So if this gap was 200% of the other gap, it's going to add 200% more additional space than it will here, if that makes sense. So it's just a different math to get there. Personally, I think that space with additional gaps is more useful in that regard, but space proportionally also works. The next one, space evenly with fixed bottom systems. So this is actually just kind of reversing if you had space evenly with this option checked. So now we can just space evenly with fixed bottom. So in this case, if you wanted to say set your bottom system so that you know that it's going to be kind of in a good place compared to the text down here and everything, and ignore all the rest of these, you could do it this way too. So now you can space evenly with a fixed bottom system. You can even include an extra margin for the top here and hit apply, and you'll see that it will space evenly, it will give you that margin here, and it will leave that bottom system exactly where it was. So one more little flexibility there. And then there's two other options here, compact tight and compact to smallest gap. So the compact tight option, I'm just going to delete this extra margin, will literally just completely undo basically all of the system's distance between spaces. So now they're all 0. So each margin is sort of overlapping with the other one, and it's just sending you back to zeros basically. Again, not all that useful unless you're dealing with larger system margins, which I know some people do it that way, but so that's available as well. There's also the compact to smallest gap, which will search the entire range here, in this case just page 2, and find out which gap is the smallest. In this case, it's going to be the gap between systems 4 and 5, and then it will make all of the rest of the systems within this range that value. So again, just hit apply, and you can see that now they're all this value, which is whatever that is, 0.1. And then for the first system, it will actually go ahead and put it up against the top page margin. Again, all of this stuff you can add, top margin and get the same results. So a ton of different options here ton of different permutations of how to use this particular plugin. So again, for me, this is why I like this plugin a lot better than the page layout space systems evenly thing, because there's just so many more options. One thing that I will mention that can get a little strange with this particular plugin is, I'm going to do something weird here. Space evenly, but I'm going to choose a really large extra margin here of 2, right, which is going to put this way down here, and I'm going to hit apply for page 2. And what you're going to see is that Finale is going to try and put all of the systems on this page with that extra margin of 2. And something strange happens because there was no way for this to happen unless the systems started overlapping. So now when I select this system 5, you can see the value here is negative 0.13, which, as you may know from the previous video, really is not possible unless you turn off the avoid margin collisions option here, which you can see it's still selected. So I think what's going on is that when you do this and set this margin like this, and which would create something where they would have to overlap, Finale temporarily turns the avoid margin collisions off and then turns it back on after it does this. So you do have to be careful, because it is entirely possible with this plugin to get overlapping systems if you're not too careful. Occasionally there is a scenario, let's see if I can do this. Occasionally there is a scenario where you could force this plugin to reflow the system so that they go on to the next page. Let me see if something like this, where you have a really high extra margin on the top, compact the smallest gap, would that do it? Yeah. So now you can see that something like this would actually result in being able to only have 3 systems on this page, and actually this requires a update layout so that you can see that that 4th system is now on the next page. So again, another thing to be careful of, particularly when you're using really extreme extra margins here, is that you can get a situation like this. There is an interesting option here, lock next page break when needed. With this option checked, if I have it set up exactly like this and get the same results where that 7th system now has to go on the next page, with this option checked, you can see what happens is that Finale now takes that 8th system, which previously had started the next page, and locked it so that this 8th system will always be at the top of a page. And then it did the same thing with system 12, with system 16. Kind of strange in my opinion. I was trying to think of a scenario where having this option checked would be useful with this plugin. I'm not completely 100% sure, but maybe there's a scenario where this actually could be helpful, and this would prevent system 8 from ever being anything other than the first system of a page, if that makes sense. But really unlikely that you would run into a scenario like that, but just out of abundance of caution, I thought I would mention it, and just to kind of complete the space systems plugin tutorial here. There you go. All right, so there you go. That is the space systems evenly function from the page layout tool, which is mildly helpful in my opinion, but then the space systems plugin in the plugin menus, which is what you're looking at here, in my opinion, is really helpful. So hopefully this has helped. On the next video, we're going to look at some of the last few things in the page layout tool, which is actually the first 6 different options here for blank pages, page breaks, and staff systems. So we'll look at those items next. And yeah, we're getting close to the end of the Perfecting Page Layout tutorials. All right, so once again, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. It's most appreciated. And I will see you soon on the next video.